The UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, says global displacements have risen by 4% as people continue to flee wars, violence, persecution and human rights violations despite the coronavirus pandemic. In a new report released in Geneva on Friday ahead of World Refugee Day, 82.4 million people were displaced last year, up from 79.5 million at the end of 2019.
According to this year's UN Global Trends report, 6% of refugees worldwide are hosted in developing countries. Global forced displacements have risen for 9 consecutive years, as per the report, which also indicates that today 1% of humanity is displaced, and there are twice as many forcibly displaced people than in 2011, when the total was just under 40 million. Africa hosts nearly 6.6 million refugees, 4.5 million of whom are in the East, Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region. Uganda and Sudan each host at least 1 million refugees, with Ethiopia following closely at 800,000 people. Uganda is one of the top 5 refugee hosting countries globally. Neighboring South Sudan is the 4th highest refugee-producing country in the world, with 2.2 million South Sudanese refugees in mainly Uganda, Ethiopia and Sudan. 6 out of the 10 highest refugee-producing countries are in Africa. The report further states that, driven by crisis, Ethiopia, Somalia and Sudan were among the countries that registered the highest number of internally displaced persons, that is IDPs, globally, with a total of 2 million people newly displaced in 2020. The UN Refugee Agency warns that despite the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and calls for a global ceasefire, conflict continue to force people from their homes, as well as impacts of climate change, such as floods and droughts. More than 2/3 of all the people who fled abroad came from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan and Myanmar. The report also notes that at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, over 160 countries had closed their borders, with 99 states making no exception for people seeking protection. Sarah Kimani, SABC News in Kenya.
Joining us now to discuss the issue of the plight of refugees, especially here in South Africa and further afield, we are now joined by Father Rampe Hlobo from the South African Catholic Bishops' Conference, Migrants and Refugee Office. Father Hlobo, thank you so much for joining us. A very good evening to you. Welcome to the Globe.
Good evening to you, Sylvia, and good evening to the viewers.
Now, do define for us, if you can, refugees, migrants and asylum seekers in the perspective of the Church.
Well, refugees, if we use the 1951 Geneva Conventions, are people who have been forced to flee their homes because of persecutions or belonging to certain groups or their belief in, that is, religion and political opinions. So these are people who are forced because of those convictions and situations they find themselves in. And then you have migrants, which are mainly people who move from one country or a place that they would normally call home to seek a better life and to improve their life, as it were. So today we celebrate World Refugee Day, which is this group of people who have been forcibly displaced, not because of their choice, but because of political situations, political convictions, wars, and other convictions which they hold.
Now, Father Hlobo, the Church, in particular the Methodist Church and the Catholic Church in South Africa, have been at the forefront in preserving the dignity and the integrity of refugees and asylum seekers alike by offering refuge to them. Is this perhaps a temporary measure, or is it an extension of the Church's long-term mandate?
Well, I think maybe we need to clarify the fact that refugee, for example, refugee status is offered by the host government. It's not the Church itself. The Church, what it does, it responds to the socio-economic needs, the spiritual needs and psychosocial needs of those who have been forced to flee their countries. So we don't offer refugee status as the Church, but we respond to the needs of those who have been forcibly displaced.
And then in terms of the resettlement of new arrivals, then what is the role of the church?
The role of the church is to, like I said, to respond to their needs, and particularly because we believe that as human beings, we have the inherent human dignity, which everybody carries, and that cannot be violated. So when they flee their countries and come to another country seeking refuge, they come having had their human dignity violated through violation of what we call human rights. So we respond to those needs by trying to help them pick up the pieces, as it were, by offering psychosocial therapy, or responding by helping them to have access to things like health, social needs, and other needs that they may have, that any other human being may have. And those, we know, those are the needs that give us dignity as human beings. So basically, fundamentally, is to make sure that we preserve and protect that human dignity that each and every person carries in himself or herself.
The United Nations Refugee Agency says that South Africa is a generous host country with very progressive asylum policies and laws. From what's been happening in South Africa, in particular in Cape Town, and the kind of ordeal that refugees and migrants and asylum seekers alike have had to endure, is this perhaps an accurate reflection of what's happening on the ground?
If you look at the legal framework, as it were, internationally and domestic legal framework in South Africa, it has always been said that South Africa has got a progressive legal framework when it comes to protection of refugees. But we can say de facto, it's really good. But de jure, it's really good. But de facto, it's not. On the ground, what is happening on the ground, it leaves much to be desired. We have seen many refugees who have been denied access to things like schools, having or access to health, access to documentation, and particularly with documentation. We have many asylum seekers who have applied for asylum in South Africa for many, many years. And their application their decision has not been taken whether they are given refugee status or not. People, they remain asylum seekers for over 10 years. And that is problematic, because once documentation is not decided upon, then it means access to services is denied. That is a challenge. That is one of the fundamental problems that many asylum seekers and refugees experience in South Africa. And the temporary nature of the refugee status granted to many of the refugees is also problematic, because then it denies them access to services that they need, access to services that may help them to pick up the pieces and to live decent and dignified lives. So there is a challenge there. A legal framework looks good, but implementation of policies is still not good. It leaves much to be desired.
Now, speaking of access to services, do you think that refugees and migrants alike should receive the same level of services and the same kind of rights that indigenous citizens of a particular country are enjoying? Should the migrants as well be enjoying such?
I think it's important for us to clarify you see, when we deal with concepts like, if you talk of a refugee or a migrant, like I said earlier on, many of the migrants, they leave their countries to seek greener pastures, as it were. And there's a procedure which is followed to help them with documentation. But with regards to refugees, there is a legal framework in place, like even we can use the 1951 Geneva Convention, we can use the Global Compact on Refugees, which really gives them the rights. And countries have ratified those conventions and those documents, saying that they commit to protecting refugees. And once a country has ratified those conventions, then basically what they are saying is they will treat refugees same as their citizens. So basically that legal framework provides protection and access to services like any other citizen of that country where refugees find themselves. So it is imperative for us to understand that countries have ratified those conventions, or countries that have ratified those conventions, they basically have made a kind of a commitment to support refugees who arrive at their shores.
You know, Father Hlobo, it's interesting that you're saying that, because the Refugees Amendment Act in South Africa is a tough new law that restricts the kind of work that refugees can do in South Africa, and it also prohibits them from, engaging in any political activity here in South Africa. And perhaps that suffices to mention that it's in violation of that legal framework that is just mentioned.
Yes, and if you look at the statement that the bishops released 2 days ago, there is a concern that we have now countries moving away from that commitment that they have made by ratifying those conventions. Basically, now there is this kind of what some people have called burden shifting, not wanting to take their fair share of responsibility of taking care of refugees. So it's like a global trend that is happening, and we've seen it even in Europe with people arriving, trying to seek asylum there, being pushed back, especially in the Mediterranean area. We've seen even in America how during the Trump era, how many refugees or asylum seekers coming from Latin America trying to seek asylum or ask for refugee status in America, they'll be pushed back. So there is that trend where now countries, they are shying away from the commitment that they have made, they've previously made. Even here in Africa, some of the countries that were known to be generous when it comes to receiving refugees and giving protection to refugees, they are now beginning to kind of move away from that commitment. And that moral obligation, it's a serious concern for the church, because we as the church, we are concerned primarily, like I said earlier, on the protection of the human person because of the inherent dignity that each one of us have. And we all have a right to a dignified life, as it were.
All right, Father Hlobo, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, sir.
All right, that was Father Rampe Hlobo from the South African Catholic Bishops' Conference, Migrants and Refugee Office, joining us via Zoom, and just commenting on the plight of refugees and asylum